morning, everyone. So I am so excited to be back in Romania after almost 30 years. It was the first time I was here, so it was the early 1990s, and clearly a lot has changed since the early 1990s. Romania has come a long way with companies like Bitdefender that I hear about all the time in the United States. Just looking around this is a very different place than I saw in the early 1990s, and I've come a long way since that time too. When I came here, I was welcomed to Romania by a group of college students, and I was a scruffy, dirty, long-haired college student. And since that time, I've come back to Romania and helped to launch a couple of, or not Romania, but Eastern Europe, and helped to launch a couple of companies that both listed on NASDAQ, and then I also helped to bring some other incredible companies to market like Dropbox and Eventbrite and Lookout, and I've also written a book that is about growth hacking, not surprisingly, and that's been translated into 16 languages. And so today, what I'm going to share with you is how I helped to grow companies that led to really breakout success, so that hopefully you too can apply this approach to your companies and also achieve breakout success. So what we're going to cover is, first we're going to look at what is this approach that leads to these amazing results in these businesses. And then next we're going to go into 4 steps that you can follow so that you can adopt this approach and achieve really, really great results in your business. So let's start with the results. Really, this is all about driving customer impact, driving really change to customers and bringing a lot of value to customers. And so when you think about some of the really successful companies that have launched in recent years and think about how they've changed our lives, we've got a company like Slack that changes the way that we communicate inside businesses, a company like Acorns, which is mostly focused in the United States, but it's gotten 5 million millennials who probably wouldn't be investing to now be active investors. Uber, of course, changes the way that we move around and get places. And then Airbnb changes the way that we travel. And so all of this has happened really fast and driven incredible value for a lot of people. But it's also driven a lot of pain for companies like the taxi companies or the hotel chains. They've been disrupted by this, and so there's positive that comes and negative that comes. And the positive is, if you're an early stage company, you can use these approaches to be very disrupting, and even a later stage company can adopt a lot of these. But if you don't adopt these approaches that I'm going to talk about today, then you face the challenge of having to compete against companies that are using them, and potentially the same type of disruption that we've seen in companies like Marriott and Hilton and the taxi businesses. So this approach, not surprisingly, is growth hacking. And growth hacking, while the name is relatively new, it's based on something that's been around for a long time, which is really just the scientific method. So what we learned about in school, where you analyze the situation, look for opportunities to improve the situation, and come up with ideas and hypotheses around those ideas, test those ideas, learn from the testing, and just continuing to do this. But instead of focusing on driving innovation, this is around using that scientific process to drive a result, to improve how you reach customers and provide value to customers. And so there's really 3 key requirements for a company to be able to apply this approach. The first is a growth mindset. So you have to have the mindset where you recognize that nothing you do in your business is perfect. There's always a better way to do everything, and you're constantly striving to find what that better way is. But you have to always be seeking that there is a better way, and if you think you've got something perfect, it's not true. And so that's the first part. And mindset is hard to change. The second is data at the core of the organization. So you need to truly understand what's happening, and it's not some other department that you occasionally ask questions to, but you really need to immerse yourself in all of the facts about what's going on. So qualitative facts and quantitative facts, really understanding what's going on, and then when you understand what's going on, you're more likely to be able to improve what's going on. And if you use the data in the right way, as you test and try to improve, you'll be able to really know if you're making those improvements. And then finally, shared mission is a really critical component, and probably the one that took the longest for me to figure out how important it is. And essentially, shared mission is going beyond what maybe a marketing team is focused on, and you've got a different set of goals that a product team, and a different set of goals that maybe the engineering team's focused on. And when that happens, it's really hard to get people to work together. But when you actually have a shared mission of what you're trying to achieve, and everyone in the company is focused on achieving that, it's much easier to get people to work together to achieve it. So we'll talk more about these as we go on, but as I give you a couple of examples, you're going to probably initially think, oh, this is more of a business-to-consumer type thing. But the truth is that these three factors apply equally in business-to-business as well. So maybe you have more data in a consumer business. Maybe you can experiment quicker in a consumer business. But a business-to-business company or a business-to-enterprise company also should be striving for improvement and should be working together as a team toward a shared mission to achieve that improvement. But most of the companies that have used growth hacking effectively, they started when they were relatively small. So often it's associated with startups, and that's because growth mindset requires a different way of thinking, and often requires even a different culture in the business. And so, not surprisingly, an early stage startup is easier to change the culture and the way of thinking. And most of these companies are also business-to-consumer companies. And so, but you are seeing more and more B2B companies adopt this approach as well. And what you're also finding is that companies that really dial in this process, so I would say that Facebook is probably one of the best companies in the world at growth hacking. And it started with them really just disrupting MySpace. But pretty soon, they've moved into the marketplace area, so they're competing in marketplace. And in the United States, at least, it's different in each market. But in the United States, I recently sold a bunch of products on Facebook Marketplace, and I listed them on all of the competing services. I got about 1,000% higher response rate on Facebook Marketplace. And you might say, well, that's because they have 2 billion users on their platform and they can leverage that. And that's partially true, but I think a big advantage for them is actually using this growth hacking process of analyzing and prioritizing tests and testing and learning and driving improvement that's made it so that they can compete in marketplace. And now they're starting to disrupt in the dating space. They just recently in the United States expanded into dating. They're in messaging, they're in payments. There's just so many things that they're doing. And for a long time, they hid all of their knowledge around this process of driving growth and improvement. But a lot of the people who worked at Facebook eventually got other jobs. So the head of growth at Uber was the former head of international growth at Facebook. And you see people from the growth team at Pinterest and Airbnb, and a lot of these companies are former Facebook people as well. So the good news is that unlike the days of Microsoft leveraging an operating system monopoly, a process is something that any one of us can replicate and repeat. And so you're seeing the same thing with Netflix. So Netflix initially disrupted just the video rental market and then shifted a lot of entertainment. So the cable companies, people started cutting their cable and focusing only on entertainment they could get through Netflix. And now you're seeing even Disney and Fox Entertainment coming together to create content to compete against Netflix. So as you start to think, oh, in my sector, maybe I don't need to worry about people competing with this, just recognize that you might be competing against Facebook as they move into your space. So it becomes really important to think, how do I change the way I approach growth? And that's what I'm going to talk about now is what are the steps so that you too can adopt this approach and be successful with this approach and not have to compete against it without also using it? So it starts with picking the right metric. In growth, we call this a North Star metric. And it's kind of a complicated concept, but really important. And so I'll give you some examples and explain that. Once you know what the metric is that you're trying to move in the business, then we look at what are the different parts of the business that move that metric. So traditionally, when people thought about growth, they thought about advertising. Let's just spend more money, and the more money we spend, the more we'll grow. But the truth is that If you're not very good at taking new customers and actually turning them into active customers, getting them to use your product and get value, you're not going to retain those customers. So activation is an important lever. How you engage and retain those customers is important. How you drive referral, monetization, every one of these points all affect this key metric, and so you need to be able to drive improvement across all of those points. You drive that improvement with this growth hacking process. So it's this rapid, systematic testing and learning and constantly driving improvement on your North Star metric. And then the last part I'm going to cover is one of the most challenging parts of growth hacking, is that you as an individual might say, oh, we have to do this. This is the right thing for us to do as a business. But then you go into your company, and if other people don't believe that this is the right thing to do, you're going to get frustrated. You're going to have a hard time getting everyone else to work together, because I talked about you've got not just advertising, which would only be maybe a marketing team, but you have core product engagement, core product activation, revenue. All of these touch different departments in the company, and if you can't get those departments working together to implement a growth hacking process, you're going to fail with it. So I'll give you some tips for overcoming some of the organizational challenges. But let's start with the North Star metric. So the North Star metric is really the whole purpose of this testing process, is to grow a key metric. And if you pick the wrong metric, there's a good chance you're not really driving sustainable growth in the business. So there's two things that happens with this. One, if you pick the right metric, sustainable growth is a function of how much value you deliver to customers. If customers are getting a valuable experience from your product, they're going to keep coming back, and growth is going to be something that you can sustain over time. The other part that's really beneficial about having a North Star metric is that if everyone on the team understands that metric, they're much more likely to work together to grow that metric. And so the right metric drives cross-functional alignment and goes a long way to that last challenge that I talked about, which is the cross-functionally trying to execute a growth hacking process. So it tends to be a little bit confusing on what a North Star metric is, so I think it's best to just give you some examples. The examples tend to make it easier to understand. So for companies like Uber or Lime, what they're trying to grow every single week, they're focused on how many rides are we delivering through our service. So for Uber, every time someone takes a ride with Uber, there's value that's created for that rider, and there's also value that's created for the driver. So the driver makes some money, the rider gets where they need to go. So just having a lot of app installs doesn't bring a lot of value to people. It's not until they actually open the app, order the car, get the ride, that the value happens. So everyone on the Uber team is working to maximize the number of rides that are being delivered. For Lime, it's a little simpler. There's not necessarily a benefit to the scooter or a benefit to the bike with Lime. It's really just the rider, but it's the same thing. The more rides that people take with Lime, the more value that they're getting, and the more likely those people are going to keep using the service. For Slack and Facebook, so one very B2B, one very business to consumer, but they have the same metric, which is just daily active users. So they're trying to grow the daily active user number. I think Facebook's at over 2 billion daily active users now, and they know that the more daily active users, the more value that's happening in their platform. So Slack and Facebook are both really, the real value of that product is the people that are using that product, and so trying to grow the number of people is critical for growing the value in the business. So my co-author on Hacking Growth works at Facebook, and one of the things that he told me is that anyone at any given point can type in their equivalent for daily active users, they actually call it daily active people, and type that into their browser, and they'll see exactly what the trend line is on this number. And so Facebook was probably the first that I really heard about pushing this concept of a North Star metric. And again, when everyone's focused on growing it, it's a lot easier to get teams to work together to grow that metric. And for Acorns, I mentioned the goal of Acorns is to get people to invest, particularly young people who are less likely to invest. And so for them, the North Star metric is active investors. So the more investors they have on the platform, the more value they're creating. But the other thing is their mission as a business is to create investors out of millennials. So get millennials to become investors. And so that's the other benefit of the right North Star metric. It's not just measuring value delivered to customers, but it's also progress against the mission in the business. And so you compare that to, say, revenue. Revenue is really important in the business, but a lot of people who aren't in direct revenue generating roles are not as motivated every day to come in and grow a revenue number. But when the mission of the business is to grow the number of investors who are among the millennials, if they can grow the millennial investors out there, they really feel like they're making progress on the mission and they feel like they're doing something important. So that's one of the big reasons why you wouldn't just use revenue as your North Star metric, is that having something that's tied to value and tied to progress on the mission is actually more engaging for the team to really work to grow that metric. The other reason is that sometimes revenue and value don't move together. So if you take, for example, Facebook, daily active users is what they're trying to grow, but if they were instead focusing on revenue, what they might say is, well, the fastest way to grow revenue, let's just double the number of advertisements on each page. That would work. They would actually see immediately a doubling of revenue as long as the demand from advertisers were there. But what you would see on the other side is that the customer experience would get hurt to the level where less and less users would be using the product, and so value would go down, revenue would go up, and eventually that revenue would go down too. So what you need is a North Star metric that is consistently going up, that is tied to value, and ideally your revenue is moving with that number. It makes it much more sustainable. So once you've figured out what your North Star metric is, then it's really important to understand how in your business you grow that North Star metric. So I mentioned for a lot of companies, when you think about growth, it's simply, do we spend more money on advertising or not? That's what drives growth in the business. And it's true, that actually does drive growth to some degree. But if you're not good at taking those new people and getting them to actually use the product and pay for the product, you're not going to be able to keep paying for that advertising because you don't have a good return on investment. But you're also not going to really be delivering value. So activation tends to be a really important metric for driving your North Star metric, or a really important lever for driving it. I'm going to give you an example at the end that shows how at one company that I worked on, I was focused on driving activation, or focused on driving acquisition initially, and really couldn't drive growth in the business. It wasn't until we focused on activation that suddenly I could spend 1,000 times more money on driving profitable growth in the business. So they're tied together. Of course, if I can get my existing users to bring in more users, that also helps to drive growth in the business. If I could get my existing users to use more often, that helps to drive growth in the business. If I can figure out a better way to monetize customers, I can afford more bringing them in the first place. So all of these are levers that ultimately move your North Star metric. So it's important for you to try to understand, what does each one of these levers look like in your company? So looking back at this example of Acorns that I talked about, the problem that they were trying to solve, or that they're trying to solve, is that millennials just really aren't investing, whether it's because it's too complicated, or they don't want to give up their lifestyle, or the attention span is too short to figure out investing. Whatever the reason, millennials really aren't investing. And so the solution that Acorns had was to make it really easy to get started investing. So what their promise is that you can start investing in less than 5 minutes. In 5 minutes, you're going to be able to make your first investment, and it starts as a really small investment, like less than $1. And after you make that first investment, then they automate additional investing so that 50 cents maybe turns into $5 after a month, and then $10, and eventually it's hundreds of dollars and then thousands of dollars. And so they can kind of give you the ability to get into the complexity of investing over time, so that they really address a lot of those challenges. And they've been able to use this approach to get 5 million millennials to start investing who probably otherwise wouldn't have. So what does their engine actually look like that drives that investment? You don't need to focus so much on the individual pieces here, but just realize that it's a pretty complex engine. It's not one that's just oh, let's get better Google listings, and that's how we'll grow. But instead, it's that activation. They're really focused on how do we get it so that people are investing within 5 minutes of signing up. And so there's a lot of things they need to do to drive that. Yes, there's some channels that refer in. The biggest channel for them is actually the referral loop. So on the iOS App Store, they have almost 500,000 reviews of the app on there. And because it requires a lot of trust to invest, it really helps when you're getting recommendations from your friends, or you've got 500,000 people who said, yes, this is a great way to invest and save. And so referral and brand are really important to having the trust to get started with the process. And then the engagement loop is important too, and I'll take you through that. But all of these are working together to grow their active investors. So Slack looks a little bit different. If we look back here real fast at Acorns, there's only one referral loop, but when we look at Slack, there's really two referral loops. So Slack has got referral inside the company, and then they have another referral loop outside the company. So inside the company, if they sign up one person in the company to use Slack, there's not very much value that one person is going to get. It's a communication platform. If they're the only ones using it, they'll get zero value. And so they need to drive adoption inside the company, and I'll show you how that works. But because Slack is such a valuable communications tool for companies, there's a lot of companies that are telling other companies about it and referring it, and that's been really the key driver of their growth, is this external referral loop. Yes, they also have public Slack. Yes, they've had a lot of press. They've got some search, but it's really this great solution that starts out free that's driven a lot of word of mouth. But this internal adoption loop is where it starts to look more like a consumer business. So what they recognize is that somebody is not going to appreciate the value of Slack until they have 2,000 messages in the system. So their goal is to get a company to 2,000 messages before they give up and say, I don't get Slack. Slack's not valuable. And so how they do that is they have to get enough invites out to the rest of the team to get the team to actually come in and start using the product. And then they have this really good engagement loop as well, that just having Slack installed on your computer or going to the web page isn't going to help much. But when you start getting notifications that says you have another message in Slack, that's going to bring you back and use it. And then when you use it, you're going to reply. That person's going to get a notification. And over time, that builds the habit to where hopefully they get enough people in the company communicating to get to the 2,000 messages before the company gives up. And then the people will actually stick on the product. How we drive improvement there we'll cover in the next section. So that's what this looks like, is that internal traction box is a really important part for something like Slack. And again, that starts to look a lot more like a consumer business like Facebook. And I think that's what's really interesting about Slack, is that they took something that traditionally would be very much an enterprise type sale and figured out how to drive adoption from the bottom up inside the company by really using kind of consumer type triggers. So once you understand how your business grows, once you've figured out your activation, your acquisition, your referral loop, and what your North Star metric is, then the goal is to apply that growth mindset and start testing to drive improvement. And again, that testing loop is like any other scientific testing process. It's just about understanding, finding areas for improvement. Not every test you run is going to be successful, but you want to be able to be systematic in where you test and how you test, and that ultimately a successful test is going to have a positive impact on your North Star metric. So when you're doing that testing, you're doing it across each of these key levers of growth that moves the North Star metric. So if we look at Acorns, I mentioned that Acorns, such an important part of their business, is getting someone to that very first investment. Most of these people have never invested before. How do we make it really easy to get to that first investment? So 5 minutes to the first investment is really critical for them. So you got to think, that requires them to hook up their bank account, hook up their credit cards, fill out forms, do all of this, make their first investment, and then automate investing afterwards. And doing that all in 5 minutes is going to require a lot of testing to get it down to that. So just a couple of examples of tests that I've seen them run recently. One is this, instead of making them enter their email twice, which is kind of the normal convention when you need to have an accurate email address, what they tested was you enter it once, and then on the next screen it says, is this correct? Confirm. So it's much faster. And again, it's just saving seconds to get it below 5 minutes. Another thing that they have, so I interviewed the head of growth for Acorns for a podcast that I run called the Breakout Growth Podcast, and I had seen this going through the sign-up process and asked the head of growth about this, and basically you enter the first few digits, you enter like the numbers of your address and maybe the first couple of letters of your street name, and it says, is this your address? And I think it's using some geolocation. And so, yes, that's my address. So very fast now. Instead of having to key the whole address, it's very fast. And so when I asked her, you know, how's that working? She said, well, that's actually a test right now. And it's new functionality that just became available on iOS. And we're testing it, and so far it seems really good. And so I said, how do you stay on top of this? How did you find out this new functionality was available? And she said, one of the designers just happened to read something about it and got excited. This is another thing that we can do to try to keep us below that 5 minutes to get started. So that's one of the things when you have that shared mission where everyone understands how the business grows, then you start to have those eyes looking for opportunities to drive improvement. And again, that's the growth mindset. So Slack, the internal referral loop is really critical. And so you might, for example, say, if I can figure out a way to drive more invites for Slack, that's going to be really critical to driving our North Star metrics. So the invite loop, more invites sent is going to be really critical. And so someone at Slack at some point came up with the idea, instead of making you enter the email addresses of every single person as the only way to invite someone into Slack, let's give a link that you can send through Yammer or through whatever instant messaging system you might have to your team, and let's see if that improves the number of invites that go out. The number of invites that go out is going to improve the overall number of people who end up signing up for it. And so somebody at some point thought of that test, and that's now a part of the flow of Slack regularly. Not every test is going to work. Some tests aren't going to work, but the one thing I can tell you for sure is that if you don't run tests, you're not going to improve. You can't improve without testing, and so if you believe that, then the second part is also true. The more tests you run, the more you learn, the faster you grow. So if you only get one thing from today, it's run more tests. It's so simple, but this is a great example from Twitter from a few years ago. When they got to about 50 million users, you can see their growth started to flatten out significantly. So they grew in one quarter 10 million users, the next quarter 9 million, the next quarter only 5 million. So they were on their way to flattening out around 50 million users. But a new head of product came into the company, and he said, how many tests are we running? And he was told they're only running about 2 tests per month. It's like, we have 50 million users and we're only running 2 tests per month. So he didn't say, this is broken, we need to fix this, these are all the opportunities. He simply said, we need to run 10 tests per week. I don't care what the tests are. If we run 10 tests per week, I'm confident we're going to start growing more quickly. And from that moment on, as soon as they started running 10 tests per week, you can see their growth recovered and continued for a long time. So testing drives growth. I've repeated this in lots of businesses. So count how many tests you're currently running and figure out what your target number of tests could be. Try to hit that number. Once you hit that, see if you can start to run even more tests. Again, if you don't test, you don't improve. Testing leads to learning, leads to improvement. But the big challenge is that if you want to test across each one of those levers, different teams control those levers. And so what happens to most people is they get really excited about this concept of testing, and then they try to run an activation test or a referral test or an engagement test, and they're told, we're really busy building core product, and right now we can't run that testing. We can't afford the engineer. We can't afford the designer. So if you want to run your tests, stick in marketing. And so then they're only running marketing tests or ad tests or maybe a landing page test where it's not that hard. But if you're only running tests there, you're really missing the opportunity for some of the big things that can actually drive that true breakout growth. And so step 4 is really about overcoming that organizational friction. So I saw in company after company that organizational friction was what was holding back companies from really adopting this growth hacking process, at least across all of the levers. And I thought somebody has to have done research on how to overcome organizational friction, how to do cross-functionally working on projects and to effectively do that. So I started looking for any research I could find around that, Harvard Business Review and anything that I could find. And I stumbled across this article in Fortune that said, the surprising management genius who figured this out. And they talk about Mark Zuckerberg, big surprise. Everything else in growth points back to him. But what they said is that Mark Zuckerberg is mind-numbingly efficient about being able to get that mission statement into every conversation he has in the company, every conversation he has outside the company, 1 or 2 times. He's constantly pushing that mission of bring the world closer together, bring the world closer together, and then what's our daily active user number, pushing that daily active user number. And so to me, the more that you can emphasize what is it that we're trying to achieve, what does success look like in the business, what is the metric that drives that success, then you're much more likely to get teams working together to achieve that. And so what you have seen is a lot of businesses have introduced the concept of a growth team that's specifically responsible for driving the testing velocity. I don't recommend a growth team for everyone, but I think it can be something if you're really having trouble testing, having a team that's responsible for testing across all of the growth levers, and ultimately, if you're not running testing, you have someone to point to and say, why are we not running testing? That could be really helpful. So that a growth team is another thing that came out of Facebook. So ultimately, that's a big part of overcoming that friction to growth. And so I wanted to end with a story that really brought me to the understanding of how important testing is and how important testing across not just customer acquisition, but across all parts of the business is. So I mentioned already that I was going to touch on this. So at LogMeIn, I initially started in the traditional silos. So we started LogMeIn in Hungary in the, early 2000s. And when I went to grow the business, it was sort of like, okay, the product's done. You grow the business. I was the vice president of marketing. So like any vice president of marketing, my lens was, okay, I got to get my messaging right, but it's mostly about reaching people and bringing new people in. And so I started spending money, and I was actually pretty good at it. I had a couple of people on the team with me, and we were able to spend about $10,000 a month. So lots and lots of testing across different keywords. We could spend $10,000 a month with a profitable return on that investment. But when I tried to spend $20,000, I would lose money on the additional 10. But we had just raised $10 million as a business, and my CEO is telling me, 10,000 is not enough. You need to spend more. I'm like, I can't figure this out. But when I stepped back and I looked at the data, I realized that 95% of the people who signed up for LogMeIn never once used the product. So we had a free version and a paid version. So it's easy to say, oh, they signed up for the free version, they're a free user. But if they never use the product, we didn't really acquire them. So 95% not using the product. I could have gone to the product team and said, guys, you made the product too difficult. Make it easier. And you know what their answer would be? You're doing a bad job as a marketer. You're bringing in the wrong people. Bring the right people, and they'll actually convert. And so we would get into the traditional kind of silo wars. But instead, I brought the details to the CEO and said, I really want this business to be successful. I think we're going to have a hard time driving success in this business if people sign up and don't use the product. I didn't blame one team or the other. I just said, this is the problem. My hope was that the CEO might give me one person from the product team to do some experimenting on making the product easier to use. But he surprised me. He actually said, I want you to stop trying to find new channels. I want you to spend all of your time with your 2 other people on the marketing team and just focus on how do we get people who sign up to use the product. But then he went to the product team and he said, I want you to stop building the product. Complete freeze on the product development roadmap. All of you on the product team, the engineering team, the designers, everyone is going to work on this problem of getting new people who sign up to use the product. So when we came together cross-functionally and started to run lots of experiments and research and trying to figure out how we get more people to use the product, we actually were able to get about 1,000% improvement in the sign-up to usage rate. So instead of 95% not using the product, now we got it to only 50% not using the product, which still doesn't sound great, but what that meant was that every dollar I spent on an advertising campaign where I only got 50 cents back, now I was getting $5 back. So no new creativity. I just went back and tested all the things I'd previously tested, and now they scaled to where I could spend $1 million per month with a 3-month payback on marketing dollars invested. So 3-month payback on marketing dollars invested, kept cycling that, but that wasn't even the main thing that drove our growth. When people signed up and used the product, they started to tell their friends about it. So 80% of the people were coming in through word of mouth because people had a great experience with the product. And so, not surprisingly, as soon as we all worked together, so it took us about 3 months to get that first user experience right, as soon as we all came together and did that, that's where the business really did the hockey stick and grew really quickly. So that's the power of cross-functional. Unfortunately, after that project, we all went back into our silos and operated the old way. So that's a whole different story. But what I've kind of done since then is tried to build that process in place in companies and keep it in place and not just around one project. So going through each of the items that I covered, first thing that you need to effectively do this is pick the right metric. So not a metric that's just right for the marketing team or just right for the product team, but a company-wide success metric, North Star metric, that's really based on the value that customers get from the product, and ideally also gives you progress against your mission. That conversation, I've seen companies spend 6 months on it. Don't spend 6 months on that conversation. Time box it to maybe an hour, maybe a half hour, get all the key people in your company together, pick a metric. If that metric is not perfect, maybe change it in a month or 2, but don't change it every month. Kind of maybe you have to kind of hone in on it, but ultimately you want a metric that becomes pretty persistent long-term in the business, that this is how we gauge success in the business. And then work together with your team to understand how you grow that metric. So yesterday I had a workshop with some of the faces that I see here today, and a big part of that was having marketing head, product head, maybe the CEO, having different department leaders come together and really draw up those different boxes and how does our business actually grow to improve that North Star metric. When everyone agrees how the business grows, it's much easier for them to work together to drive improvement around how it grows. And then, once you understand how it grows, then look for opportunities for improvement. So start coming up with lots of ideas of how to drive improvement. Ideally, focus the initial testing on the area that has the most leverage for moving your North Star metric. So a really high leverage opportunity example would be that LogMeIn example I gave. We could have done equal testing across all levers, but we knew if we're losing 95% of our customers on the sign up to usage, let's put all of our energy into that problem. And then once you start testing, really work to make sure that everyone in the team across the whole company understands that North Star metric, and if you're not testing everywhere, figure out why and try to overcome the challenges that are preventing you from testing everywhere. So those are the success requirements. We've got a little bit of time for questions, and I'll invite Andre back on the stage to help me with the Q&A. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you. It was a very, very interesting presentation. A big round of applause again, please. Okay, we don't have a lot of time, but I am very curious, and the public is very curious as well about a couple of things. So one of the questions we just received is, how do you run tests in startups where the sample size is not that significant?
Right. So that's a really a question that comes up a lot. And so I think coming back to that idea of a growth mindset, if you recognize, especially in a startup, that everything you built is a test. Whether you think you built it perfect or not, it's a test, and anything you test against it is going to give you insight on that. So in a startup, two things. One, it's going to be really hard to get statistical significance early on. So you might use qualitative indicators a bit more and say, like in the case of LogMeIn, if 95% of the people are signing up and not using, there's probably some kind of usability issue. The more I understand what the issues are and try to fix those issues, maybe I'm going to primarily change something, do some user tests, change something, do some user tests, until people get less confused about getting started with the product. Another thing to deal with the sample size challenge is if you're testing button colors and you don't have very many users, you might have to test for 5 years to get some kind of statistical significance. So in the early stages, do big changes, big radical changes, completely change what your homepage looks like compared to the other one. Maybe you're not going to know which piece actually caused it, but that's less important, which piece actually caused the big improvement, but that's less important than actually making the improvement. And as you get more and more people, then you can start to kind of make the smaller tweaks to try to make it absolutely perfect. But yeah, big radical changes can be important too.
Okay, great to know. You talked about signing up and about North Star metrics. Facebook used to have a North Star metric, the number of users inviting 7 friends, right? So now it's about daily active users. How do you realize the North Star metric is not relevant anymore?
So I'm glad that question was brought up. Their North Star metric did change, but it didn't change from 7 friends in 10 days. Their North Star metric changed from monthly active users to daily active users. The 7 friends in 10 days is their activation metric. So that's the equivalent of what I talked about with Slack needing to get to 2,000 messages, or Acorns, 5 minutes to your first investment. For Facebook, if you sign up and you only have 1 friend on there, and you have that for a month, you're going to stop using Facebook. You're not going to get enough value. So for Facebook, realize that you need to have 7 friends for you to come back and see enough fresh content in your feed. And if it takes too long to get to those 7 friends, then you're not going to stick on the service. So they realize it's 10 days. If you don't get to 7 friends in 10 days, you're going to give up on the service. So that's more of an activation metric. But it is true that their North Star metric changed. It just changed from monthly active users to daily active users. And it sounds like, oh, well, that's not an important change. But actually, when daily active users became their goal, the experiments they ran became, how do I get people to come back every day? I can now count that person every day, where before, if they were looking at monthly active users, if that person came back every day or came back once a month, they counted exactly the same. So it actually did change the experiments that they ran when they changed from monthly active users to daily active users.
You just mentioned Acorns, and the last question we can get from this audience right now is Acorns available in Romania?
I do not think it is. I think it's only in the United States right now.
Okay. Thank you very much. We don't have a lot of time to continue the Q&As. Questions are starting to pop up. However, you can meet Sean at 2:30 today at the Q&A stage, and there you have another opportunity to ask him a couple of questions live and interact with Sean. Thank you very much, Sean, for your presence here, and a big round of applause for him, please.
Thank you, everyone.